In Southern Africa, living in Namibia, we came across a few quite sobering warning notices. I don't know if you've got the first one there, Marissa. Okay, look at that one. Warning, trespassers will be shot, survivors will be shot again. We actually saw that on a gate in Windhoek, where we used to live. This one is a bit more humorous, down in the Cape. Please look under your vehicles for penguins. I suppose they didn't want to spoil your afternoon drive, and you drive away from Cape Point and discover you've killed a few penguins because they went under your car. Really good. This is more sobering. This was a big campaign, I don't know if it's still going on in South Africa and Namibia, Arrive Alive. And I was saddened to read, even this week as I was checking these numbers, Namibia is the worst, has the worst fatalities of all countries in the world. I hardly could believe that, because I know my son's travelled in some South American countries and they've got some terrible roads. But per 100,000 population, Namibia has the worst. It's about 48 fatalities every month of the population. The reason for that is because I think the roads are so flat and straight that people think they can go at a tremendous pace. There's not many are tarred, but the ones that are, or paved, I think you say in America, but tarred we say, then you go very fast. And unfortunately, a lot of the fatalities are tourists. Well, they have this big campaign, and every so often along the roads you will have notices of how many people have died in the last 6 months on this stretch of road. And some people objected to the notices. They wanted the local authorities to take them down. They were out for a nice ride, or they were going somewhere to see their relatives, and they found them too upsetting. Sometimes they would have this notice, Arrive Alive, and then they'd have about 3 or 4 wrecks of cars underneath the notice. Cars that had rolled, and people had died there, and so on. It was strange, wasn't it? People wanted to take the notices away, although they were erected for their safety, to warn them, but they didn't like it. They didn't want to hear the truth about that patch of road. The truth was sometimes too disturbing. How do you react to warnings? I think as human beings we tend to be like that, don't we? We don't necessarily take them in. And Jesus issues a very important warning for us all here in our reading today. If you've got a Bible, we're looking in Luke 12 today, and we're thinking about long-term investments rather than short-term gain, long-term investments. Here's Jesus' warning, Luke 12, verse 15. Then Jesus said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." And then to illustrate the point, as we know, Jesus goes on to tell the crowds this story that Paul has just read to us. A farmer who got so rich that he didn't know what to do with all his money. What a wonderful problem to have. He just didn't know what to do with all his money. I suppose I'm trying to think of it in 21st century terms, the story might go something like this. He'd had quite a good education, this guy. He'd always worked hard. He got his first job as a junior clerk, and then he gradually worked his way up the corporate ladder. He'd really worked hard. It had taken time for him to progress and to get promotion. Of course, it had taken its toll on him. More than one broken relationship along the way. But now at the age of 55, he was on the top of his world. He'd been able to invest in quite a few properties, not just in, where should we say, UK or America or wherever, but they lived in their favourite house for the summer in one of the beautiful Greek islands. And that's where they would go. His children would come and visit holidays because they didn't live there, or they didn't live in, let's say, the UK because they were in private schools in Switzerland, which of course was a guarantee for their good education and getting on in life. They bought a nice yacht or two recently, and he enjoyed sailing that around some of the Aegean islands as well. His wife, well, she enjoyed the golf club and the country club and so on, and they enjoyed driving their various vehicles, which they changed every year, of course. Everything was going well. Even his investments in different properties and banks and so on. In fact, he thought he would probably invest a little bit more now that he had more to spare. In fact, he thought he'd almost got to the time now when he could retire. Even though he was only 55, well, I say only 55, in Greece I know it's a different story, but anyway, he thought he could retire now. And everybody who knew him said, yeah, it's a great idea. Very wise. You've got it all. You deserve it, man. Get out of the rat race now. Put your feet up. Live off all your hard work. And so now he lies back in his swimming pool, the sun setting behind the bougainvilleas at the end of the terrace. He sips his Dom Perignon champagne, and he thinks to himself, yeah, I've done pretty well. You're very lucky, but you've got everything now that you ever dreamed of. And all I need to do now is to take life easy, to eat, drink, and suddenly there's a searing pain in his chest. He can't breathe. He only just manages to haul himself out of the pool onto the slabs at the side of the pool. But it's too much, it's too late. Soon he's lying on another slab. He's dead before the ambulance can even get him to hospital. They had a big funeral for him, of course, in the company, and all his mates and the different clubs he was a member of. His friends and his colleagues, they gave great tributes to him in his funeral, what a hard-working guy he was, how he deserved it all, and of course they sang I Did It My Way by Frank Sinatra. And then they went back to the golf club for a few drinks, and everybody agreed actually it was really tough on him, because he hadn't been able to enjoy all the success he'd won, worked so hard for. But, you know, interestingly, at his funeral, no one called him a fool. No one called him a fool. He might have been stupidly rich, but no one said he was stupid. He was the ultimate success. A self-made man. Everything he wanted. So why does Jesus say at the end of his life that God called him a fool? This guy. What was foolish about his way of life? What was unwise about his investment plan? What was wrong with his thinking? Well, I want to suggest there are at least three things we can glean from this parable this morning that Jesus says there's three things at least that were wrong with the way that he thought. First of all, he thought he was rich. He thought he was rich. Now, of course, on one level, he was rich. Stupidly rich. He had a successful business, he'd done well. He had this very pleasant problem. He said, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Now, let's just notice at the beginning that Jesus doesn't condemn this man because he was rich. Doesn't condemn him because he's successful in business. That's not the issue here. Jesus doesn't condemn him even for enjoying life. In fact, the New Testament tells us that everything God has created is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, acknowledging that it comes from God. So God is not some sort of celestial spoilsport, a killjoy up in heaven who's rather anxious that none of his creatures enjoys themselves too much. That's not what Jesus is getting at here. God's made this world. He's been so gracious to us. He's given us it to be enjoyed. I mean, just think of all the blessings he showers upon us. Food, drink, friendship, families, fun, new experiences, adventure, travel, recreation, sport, relaxation, music, literature, the arts, love, relationships. I could go on. All this is part of God's riches that he intends us to enjoy. So Jesus isn't saying here it's wrong to enjoy life. It's not wrong to eat and drink. That's not the issue. The issue that Jesus is addressing in this story is not the enjoyment of our possessions and our gifts in life, but how do we regard them, our attitude towards them? Whether we would class ourselves as well off or not doing so well. You see, there's nothing inherently wrong with being rich. Neither is there anything inherently right or virtuous about being poor. The amount of riches is not the issue here. The issue is, what is our attitude of heart? To however much or little we have, what's our attitude of heart? Do our riches, do our possessions, do they rule our decisions, our wealth? Do they drive our lives? Is that what we're living for? Is that how we measure our value? Is it these things that give us our significance? Because if it is, if that's what we're living for, then Jesus says you're a fool. If that's what you're living for, you're a fool. And so he warns us that you can be rich in this material sense, but end up being poor. Poor spiritually, poor towards God, as he says in the closing verse of the parable. You can spend all your lifetime investing in earthly material treasure, but have no treasure in heaven. I read someone has said that if you own any possession you cannot give away, you no longer own it. It owns you. It possesses you. Someone asked John Paul Getty, the American billionaire, reputed to be one of the richest men that's ever lived, I suppose. Someone asked him, "How much money do you have?" Getty replied, "Not enough. Not enough." That's the trouble, isn't it? There's never enough. So Jesus says, beware of greed. Now Jesus, of course, was answering a man in the crowd who interrupted him while Jesus was teaching with this question which betrayed this man's priorities. He said, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus had been teaching about amazing, interesting, very significant things, but all that was on this guy's mind was money. And so he interrupted Jesus and said, "I want the money that's coming to me. Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And Jesus says, "Be on your guard. A person's life does not consist in the amount of his possessions. Your life is more than that." True riches are measured in a different currency than simply your bank balance, or the size of your house, or the labels on your clothes, or however different ways you might think you have significance or value. This guy thought he was rich, but at the end, he's not rich towards God. He's not truly rich. Short-term riches, but long-term poverty. Secondly, he thought he was immortal. In a way, he thought he was immortal. Now, I think to a certain extent, all of us think like this, don't we? Especially when we're young. But even when we get older, we don't think of death as something that happens to me, to you. It's something that happens to other people, really. We have this sort of feeling that we're going to live forever somehow. Death seems distant and unreal, especially when you're young, of course, but it's part of our avoidance strategy, I think. And this is part of the deceitfulness of materialism and riches too. Wealth can skew your thinking. You begin to think you're invincible. Just like this man in verse 19. You have plenty of good things laid up for yourself for many years, he says to himself. Notice that, for many years. So you can do anything. You're answerable to no one now. You can face whatever the future brings. Almost as though you're immortal. But it's a delusion. It's a delusion, says Jesus. You may be able to buy certain things, but the really important things you can't buy with money. No matter how much control and power your wealth can seem to offer, the basic issues of life and death are out of your control. That's what Jesus is saying here. This guy had been taken in by what Jesus calls the deceitfulness of riches. He'd forgotten that money can buy you a bed, but not peaceful sleep. Money can buy you a clock, but not more time. Money can buy you a house, but not necessarily a home. Money can buy you medicine, but not health. Money can buy you sex, but not love. Money can buy you insurance, but not safety. Money can buy you amusements and pleasure, but not joy and happiness. Money can buy you tickets to almost everywhere to travel, but not to heaven. The deceitfulness of riches. This guy was a fool. He thought he was in control, but he wasn't. He thought he had many years ahead of him. He didn't even have tomorrow. So friends, we're not immortal. One thing is certain. you will die. Well, unless Jesus comes before that, but normally speaking, you will die. I will die. And we don't even know when that will be, sooner or later. Or we may sort of, join in with the popular songs and say, we're going to live and love forever, and usual ditties and so on. But the reality is that forever is no more certain than today, or forever. We just don't know what the future holds, do we? We can't bank on having many years laid up for us, as this guy thought. And Jesus says, if you live like that, you're a fool. You're a fool. To this man, God said, this night, your life will be demanded from you. This night. What is even more disturbing, says Jesus, is that death, inevitable, is not the end. It's like one of those slips, I don't know if they still do it, but when I was younger, you took a book out of the library and then you kept it for more than 3 weeks and you get a slip through the post telling you that we kept the book out too long. Our lives are not our own. And one day God will call in the loan. God, the great creator, has given you life, and one day the loan on that life, the lease on that life will be up. And you'll have to hand it in, as it were, and have to give an account to God for the ways that you and I have lived. Your life will be demanded from you, says Jesus. So be warned, your life consists of more than what you possess here on earth. You need to think about longer-term investments than just these short-term riches. So he thought he was rich, he thought he was immortal, and thirdly, he thought he was prepared. He thought he was prepared. You see, this man had made good plans. He'd taken care of the future. He thought he'd had a good investment portfolio. He had good insurance policies in place. He'd made adequate preparations for a safe and enjoyable life. But his plans were short-sighted. They were short-term only. And when that heart attack struck, and he was staring death in the face, all his wealth counted for nothing. He was poor. Now again, of course, there's nothing wrong in making plans for the future. There's nothing wrong in him building his barns. Jesus isn't criticizing him for being rich. What Jesus' warning is about is the wrong attitude towards our wealth and towards our lives. Whether our wealth is little or a lot, or whether our lives are short or long. In this short parable, there are at least 11 personal pronouns just in 2 verses. It's all about me. It's myself, me, my, I will do this. What should I do? My barns, my goods. I'll say to myself, me, take life easy. It's all about himself. This man's only interested in storing up wealth for himself. He's motivated by selfishness and greed. He had no thought of sharing it with others who might be in need, and no acknowledgement that all that he had was from God anyway. So when God, his maker, called him to account for his long-term investments, his spiritual bank balance was empty. He had nothing. In fact, it was worse than that. He was very much in the red. He had debts that money could never settle. What do I mean? Well, he had offences against God and offences against his fellow man. He had moral lapses. He had sins. He had said and done things that no amount of money could ever clear. He had thoughts which he was ashamed, and you can't just wipe them away by writing a check. He was in debt. He thought he was well prepared, but he had nothing. He was not rich towards God, says Jesus. And that's the ultimate tragedy of this man's life. This is the warning, really, that Jesus gives us here. This man had been busy with plans and schemes and projects, but all his planning, all his preparation was now so woefully inadequate. He'd been preparing, but not for the right things. I well remember a friend of mine. We both arrived on the last morning of our exams in university for our finals. In those days, finals were finals. You couldn't really take them. We were standing outside the exam room, and Steve said to me, "So what do you think they're going to ask us about?" And he said, "About Johnson and Swift, and we were doing English literature." I said, "Johnson and Swift? It's not 18th century today, Steve. It's 19th century." Well, he nearly fainted. He nearly dropped on the floor. Poor guy, he'd been spending the last 3 or 4 days since the last exam preparing, and he prepared for the wrong exam. And now it was too late. I think he did pass in the end, but it was a disaster, that paper. And this guy had been making preparations, but all for the wrong thing, really. And so Jesus says to us, watch out. Be on your guard. You could be doing exactly the same thing, really. We could be very busy, we could be enjoying life, but we could be missing out on the most important thing. See, it's interesting that this man doesn't finish the famous quotation that he uses as a philosophy of life, does he? He says to himself, take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. He forgets the end of the quotation. For tomorrow we die. For tomorrow we die. That's the problem. That's the reality. Material pleasures. This life doesn't last. Pleasure is overshadowed by pain, life by death. It's inescapable. But I think like this man, we try to block out that reality of death. We cope sometimes by avoidance, but that's not a very good or very wise long-term strategy. It's going to come. So be prepared. That's what Jesus is saying. This man was foolish, so we might ask, well, where can true wisdom be found? What was wrong? How can we make wise investments to ensure that we don't end up in spiritual poverty, all unprepared to meet God, the one who has given us life? Well, it's not actually in the parable, but if you read on, Jesus clearly points out in the next paragraph. Seeking true riches, how to find a real treasure. He says, do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom. Because where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Jesus is reminding us about the right priorities in life. He says, doesn't he, quoting the Old Testament, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. You see, if we are to truly live, then we need more than purely material resources. Life is too big to be satisfied simply by eating and drinking. Life is too big because it's made by God. God has given us life. And only God can fill it. Only God can satisfy us. The purpose of life is not to amass wealth, which must all be left behind when we die. The purpose of life is to live in such a way as to be rich now and for eternity towards God. And of course, if God should bless you with wealth, then thank him. And you have the responsibility to use it for his glory. J.D. Rockefeller, another American billionaire, the oil tycoon, unlike John Paul Getty, said this. He wrote, God gave me my money. I believe the power to make money is a gift from God, to be used and developed to the best of our ability for the best of mankind. Actually, I was reading that Rockefeller operated on what he called the 10-10-80 principle. 10%, the first tenth, he always gave to God, he tithed. 10% he tried to save, and the rest, he said, he lived on meeting his own family needs and the needs of others as he felt directed. He was, of course, a great philanthropist. So Jesus says, beware of greed and selfishness. Don't live that way. The purpose of life is to live it in such a way as to be rich towards God. It's to find the treasure of his kingdom. And of course the treasure is not a thing, it's not a commodity, it's not silver and gold. It's a person, it's Jesus Christ himself. That's the treasure. You see, the wonderful thing about Jesus is this. He didn't just come to the earth to tell stories like this parable, to warn us about making this mistake of missing out on life now and life eternally, as God intended it to be. He didn't come just to warn us. He came to save us from that sort of mistake, from the consequences of living our lives as though this all there is, and God doesn't really matter. He came to save us from the consequences of having to face God with no excuses and great debts for all eternity. You see, literally, at the end of the day, your day or my day, however that will come, it's God's verdict that really matters on our lives. It's what God says about it that really matters. Not even your friends or your family. So the question really is this: how are you living your life? You see, if in this life we've practically said no to God, I don't want you to be the center of my life, I want to be the center, then God will give us what we want. He'll give us life without him, this side of death and after death. And that existence, without God, without his love, without his mercy and forgiveness, without his gifts, forever, that existence the Bible calls hell. And though God doesn't want that to come to any of us, if that's what we want, that's what we'll get. That was this guy's big mistake. This man succeeded in getting most of the treasures of this world that was on offer, but he missed out eternally. If eternity is real, friends, then this world is not enough. We can't just be living for this world. We can't just be living for wealth and prosperity. If eternity is real, we need more. We need more. We need much more. We need the riches of forgiveness. We need the riches of acceptance before God through the death and resurrection of Jesus. We need the riches of eternal life. We need real hope for the future. We need to be prepared. We need Jesus Christ, the Son of God, to be our rescuer, our hope, our vision, our inspiration. We need to make long-term investments for eternity. I see you quoting all Americans this morning. American President Barack Obama, you might have heard of him. He said this: focusing your life solely on making a buck shows a poverty of ambition. It asks too little of yourself. It's only when you hitch your wagon to something larger than yourself that you realize your true potential. Well, I don't know what he was thinking about, but friends, there's nothing larger to hitch the wagon of your life to than God himself. And the way to get connected is through Jesus Christ. And as you do that, you find that you've discovered real, lasting treasure, and you will be rich towards God. So friends, no, it's not wrong to be rich if God blesses you that way. The Bible doesn't teach that, and that's not really what this parable is about. It's not wrong to save, to put money in the bank if you've got enough to spare. That's wise. But it is wrong when we love these things practically. We wouldn't say so, of course, but when we love these things more than God. When these things shape our lives more than God's will or God's values. It is wrong when we see our money and our wealth as all mine. It's mine. When we forget that in reality, we are stewards, looking after it for God, putting it to work for God. Our money, our time, our gifts, our whole lives, everything we have is the Lord's. And we're responsible to him as to how we use it. And Jesus warns us here. It's so easy, whether it's little or lot, it's so easy to be greedy. it's so easy to put other priorities than God's priorities into our lives. And remember, it's God's assessment that ultimately counts. Not our friends, not our family, not our colleagues, not our acquaintances, not even the history books if you get that famous to be mentioned in them. No. The question, says Jesus, is what will God say when your summons, my summons, to meet him, whether we're old or young, when that finally comes, what will God say? Foolish or wise? Poor or rich? Because we're rich towards God. Friends, this world is not enough. We must live for more than that. We need to make long-term investments for eternity and use all that God has given us for his glory. Can we say with the old hymn writer, I thank thee, Lord, that here our souls, though amply blessed, can never find, although they seek, a perfect rest, nor ever shall, until they lean on Jesus' breast, until we trust in him and live our lives for his glory. Be on God. Well, we're going to finish with 2 more songs to worship.